Hi, everyone. So this is a very short little voice PowerPoint covering some things to think about with a quasi-experimental design. So I want to start with a quiz. What are the 3 requirements for a true experimental design? There's A, B, C, and D. Take a minute and pick your answer. And of course, you remember from the True Experimental Design lecture, the things that are required are randomization, a control and an experimental group, and an intervention. So when we're talking about quasi-experimental, it's missing one of those 3 components. It either doesn't have randomization or it doesn't have a control group, but you're usually testing an intervention. So quasi-experimental designs live, as we discussed earlier in the course, sort of this trajectory of the development of science around an area. You usually start with descriptive, and that's just describing the problem or the population. Then you begin to explore relationships between variables and try to see if possibly one causes the other. And that moves you into experimental. Quasi-experimental sits in between those 2, where you're still sort of exploring the relationship between variables. You think there's a cause and effect, but you don't think it's strong enough that you need to do a randomized controlled trial yet. So let's talk about what some of these quasi-experimental designs could look like. Quasi-experimental design number 1 is a 1-group pre-test, post-test design. So what you have is an intervention, and you decide that you're going to do a pre-test and look at how people do on the variables, the outcomes of interest. Then you're going to do your intervention, and then you're going to measure those folks again. And we just finished writing up a manuscript of this type of design. There's an obesity intervention that we pilot tested in Sheridan with a group of mostly Hispanic kids, but we offered it in a bilingual format because we didn't have enough Caucasian kids to do their own group. So we looked at what they were eating, their physical activity, and their BMI. And then we also looked at some labs, and we did that at baseline. Then we did the intervention over a semester, and then we got the post-test. So it looks very promising. There were good outcomes from this, but because we didn't have a control group, we can't say absolutely, but we can say this probably warrants further study. So that's an example of a 1-group pre-post-test design. There's a couple other examples. So you might do a time series design. You might do a pre-test followed by the intervention and then measure a couple more times. And this is particularly helpful when you're interested in a quality improvement kind of project and see if the intervention or the strategies you implemented are going to sustain the change over time, or if we think that it's going to take a while for something to occur. So childhood obesity, again, is a good example. You may do your pre-test, you may do your intervention, but it really takes a while for people to adopt new behaviors like eating different and being active. So there might not be a change in BMI until that 3rd observation point. Then you can also do a time series design where there's intervention 1 and intervention 2. And so you do a baseline, let's say treating fever in children. you get a baseline, you see they're febrile, you give them Tylenol, you get another measure, and then you decide you'll alternate with ibuprofen, and then you'll get another measure. And then that helps you look at, is combining those two interventions more effective? Sometimes you can do this with a couple of groups and be able to answer the question, is one more effective than the other, or do they work better together? But time series can be done with two interventions. Then you can also have an interrupted time series design. And it's a series of measurements, and then your intervention, and then a series of measurements. And this, again, is particularly helpful where, where you think that the intervention of interest might, sorry about that, might actually take a while to change. And so you want to know maybe what the average is over a couple months at baseline, and then do your intervention, and then do the average over, or do measurements 3 times after, just to see if there was change over time as you moved forward. There's also the non-equivalent pre-test, post-test control group design. So this one's designed exactly like a randomized controlled trial, but when you get the baseline measures, you discover that those two groups are very different. So because those groups were not the same at baseline, this is considered a non-equivalent pre-test, post-test with a control group. And it's considered quasi-experimental if your groups were not equivalent at baseline. This sometimes is also referred to as failure of randomization. Maybe didn't have a big enough sample size, or, you know, or maybe it just didn't work. But that's another quasi-experimental design. This one's non-equivalent post-test only. So this one has a control group, and just like the RCT that had post-test only, you just might have an intervention or a situation where you can't really do a pretest, or the pretest is going to foul up either the intervention or foul up the measure. And so you do the intervention for one group, and you do the other as a control, and then you do your observation. So as you think about this, think about your area of interest, and think about what research question or what quality improvement question you might have related to your area of interest that would work best if answered with a quasi-experimental approach. Just give that some thought. Stretch your mind to think about all the possibilities of how you might do this. And I look forward to talking to you again next week.